Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am dropping our check-in prompt into the chat box. So as you come into the space, if you just want to check that out, answer a couple questions that we have on there, and then we can get started with everything. So welcome, everyone, to today's dialogue. My name is Leah Desher. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Education and Outreach Specialist for DHPSNY. Before we get started, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping notes to mention. One, if you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. And two, the session is being recorded, and the recording, as well as all the additional resources that we're going to be sharing, are going to be shared with all registrants via email within the next week or so. So I wanted to kick things off by sharing a little bit about the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for New York program, or DHPSNY, as we like to call it, as well as our work with ARIA Strategies. So DHPSNY is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as today's webinar. If you'd like to learn more about any of our services, you can find all of that information on our website at DHPSNY.org. So now I'm going to pass things over to John to sort of situate this program within the larger context of the work being done at the state level.
Thank you, Leah. My name is John Diefendorfer. I work in the Documentary Heritage Program at the New York State Archives. The State Archives sits under the State Education Department, and the Education Department is governed by the Board of Regents. And earlier in 2020 and 2021, the Regents issued their DEI framework and policy statement, as well as their culturally responsive sustaining education framework. So we and DHPSNY took this opportunity to provide sort of parallel programming to support similar work amongst the cultural heritage community in New York State. So that's sort of where this webinar and this series of programs sit in the big bureaucratic picture of state government. So that's sort of the big picture view, and I'll pass it back to Leah.
Thank you, John. And so because DHPSNY is positioned as a resource and a connector for cultural institutions and heritage organizations throughout New York, we've recognized that it's really important for our efforts to be more actively engaged in doing and fostering anti-racism work within the field. So for this reason, we've been working with ARIA Strategies to get a sense of what type of work our constituents are already doing and where folks like you around the state are interested in further developing your learning. So ARIA Strategies is a firm that provides mission-driven solutions for nonprofits based in Rochester, New York. And we're really grateful to have ARIA facilitating this webinar today, along with Justin, Colette, and David, who will all introduce themselves in a little bit. And so with that, I'm going to pass things over to ARIA to set the space for us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, John. It's so good to be together today. The last time we were together for a webinar was back in September of last year. So I'm so pleased to be with everybody today. So thanks for joining us. Thanks also to DHPSNY and our New York State partners who are making this work a priority. And thanks so much to Colette, David, and Justin for co-facilitating with me today. I'm going to set the space just going over our norms and agreements, our objective and agenda for today, and structure and expectations for this webinar. We developed these norms and agreements as a group way back in January of 2022. At our very first dialogue, norms and agreements help us create the container for the conversation and let us know what the sort of guardrails are for our conversations. So today we're going to lead with love, understand that this is a journey. We're going to drop the mic, step up, step back, which means if we're usually talkative and offer a lot of input, we're going to step back and listen. And if we're typically listeners in the room, we're going to be brave and step up to offer some of our own insights. We're going to speak for ourselves, center inclusion, respect, and mutual positive regard. We're going to use direct communication, even though that can be hard. We're going to come to this space teachable, open our minds, really listen, stay engaged, even when we're tempted to pull back, speak our own truths, experience discomfort, expect and accept non-closure, ask questions in the chat or message directly, be responsible for what we hear, use I statements, assume best intent, and most importantly, we're going to love each other into education. Today, what we really want is for you to be able to identify practical opportunities to center Indigenous voice, experience, and perspectives in your collections, programming, and community engagement, and to do all those things grounded in relationship. Our agenda today will take us through understanding what it's like in 21st century Native America and reaching back into history a little bit to understand that. We'll spend some time talking about grounding our work in relationship, and we'll talk about practical applications of Native and non-Native partnerships. There will be time for questions and practice, and we'll share some next steps and action items with you. Today's structure is going to allow us to build community, share information, engage in discussion and debrief, and make plans for the future. We'll hear from 2 Native practitioners in the field, as well as a non-Native practitioner at a white-led organization. Ask questions and get comfortable with discomfort. This is a tough topic for us in New York. You can expect to feel uncomfortable, curious, frustrated, heard, confused, and surprised. So with that, I am very excited to ask our co-facilitators to introduce themselves. So we'll start with Justin, and then Justin can pass it to David, and then David can pass it to Colette. So Justin, we'd love to have you introduce yourself to us.
Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Cree. I'm the new director of the Akwesasne Culture Center up here in Akwesasne, and really happy to be here and to help any way I can. And I speak for myself and not really my organization or my community, just because I just want to be able to give my perspective, and it's the one I can give. Thank you. And I'll pass it to David.
Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank the Documentary Heritage and Preservation Services for their invitation today. My name is Dave Martine. I'm curator and artist of Amarinda, American Indian Artists Incorporated, started in 1987. I'm also a curator of the Shinnecock Nation Cultural Center and Museum. My heritage is Fort Sill Chiricahua Apache and Shinnecock Montauk Nations of Long Island, New York. Thank you. Like to pass it to the next person. Oh,
yeah,
thank you.
Colette, I think you're muted. You can go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Colette Lamont. I'm the curator of exhibitions at the Iroquois Museum. The museum is a private independent nonprofit in Schoharie County, which is west of Albany, very rural. Interesting that in the introduction, our organization was introduced as a white-led organization. I am non-native, and certainly we are. But our leadership, because we're a nonprofit, is really our board of directors, and our board of directors is not all white. We have several Haudenosaunee trustees on our board, and they are very involved in our organization. Although we were founded by 2 white anthropologists, so the founding definitely came out of that background.
Thanks so much for that, Colette. We're actually going to be able to talk about that a little bit later, so I'm excited. I am going to pass the mic to Justin and David to talk to us a little bit about what 21st century Native America is like. And so this slide is very like high level. It's doesn't have a lot of detail on it, but after the webinar, I added more detailed slides for folks, but this is just to help us focus on some of the big things that David and Justin lifted up for me during our planning session. So David and Justin, I'm going to toss it to you to talk about 21st century Native America.
Oh, well, probably should back up a little bit and say, yeah, I'm Hungwe in the sense that we're trying to transition away from terms that really don't match what we are. Like Mohawk technically doesn't even, the word M doesn't exist in the CCAHA, our language. And like, I'm glad to hear, I'm really happy to see a lot of people respect that we're moving away from Iroquois to Haudenosaunee. And these are terms that really mean a lot to us because even in my lifetime, it's just being able to kind of rediscover who we are. And that process is also taking ownership of, even how we're presented and named. It's really important. So even in my lifetime in the 21st century, it's like moving away from certain terminology. Even here in Akwesasne, we fought a long battle just to get the name of the town from Hogansburg to also be recognized as Akwesasne. So if you mail me something, you can put Akwesasne instead of Hogansburg. So, they might seem like little wins, but that group that pushed that through in the 70s really was the thought leaders that built and set up the Akwesasne Culture Center as a library first. And then we evolved into a museum. And then this year we moved into the gallery space. So I just wanted to kind of give a little more background. I guess I was a little nervous earlier about the introductions, but this to kind of explain just where I'm coming from. And up here on the slide, we do see that we're showing the U.S. portion of the Akwesasne, and that we go into Cornwall, Ontario a little bit, and Cornwall Island is completely our territory. And then we have two pieces that are in Quebec. One's just a little bit of the peninsula of St. Regis, and then the landmass above kind of the right side of the map there is SNY, and that would be it's in Quebec, but it's also part of our our home. So just there you see the one line dividing the US portion and the Canadian portion. And even in the US portion, we're divided by St. Lawrence County and Franklin County. So I always joke in classes is that I don't think they trust us much because they keep dividing us in little squares, keep us in line, I guess. But that's we're not the alone territory that's ever been like set up in the United States and split between Canada. So it is interesting to see that there's other reservations across the country that are divided that way. And as you see, we do have a general denoter there, St. Lawrence River, that could have been a nice clean way to do it, but we do believe that there was intent to kind of separate us a little bit and put us between two nations. Sorry, I took some time. I'll let David come in if he wants to say anything.
Okay, thank you very much. Just to begin with, my presentation today is related to some of the work that I've currently been engaged in with our organization, Amarinda, American Indian Artists Incorporated, which is a Native-led nonprofit organization begun in 1987. We're a multi-tribal organization, a tribally enrolled board of directors. We're founded by Diane Frere, Osage Cherokee Nations from Oklahoma, and we devote most of our time in the promotion of contemporary Native American art, which is little understood or recognized in the country, and we're working to change that. And we promote performing arts, visual, media, and literary arts. So since 1987, again, we have been working to preserve that legacy. And we also have called that movement here in New York City, the New York Movement of Contemporary Native American Art, because it is so diverse. That's the principal factor in defining the New York contemporary Native art movement for most of the 20th century, because many of the art community here have come from their various areas in the country in order to pursue freedom in contemporary Native art, in many cases getting more advanced education, in university settings, and being able to communicate their traditions through the new movement, mostly during the early new school of abstract expressionism, pop art, and all the modernist movements of American modernism. One of our founders, or a couple of them, Jean Quincy Smith is one, Lloyd Oxendine, Lumbee Nation is one of our founders, George Morrison, and so forth. These people wanted their art recognized in the overall context of American modernism and not just as a Native American defined movement. And so that we work for the appreciation and support of Native art within the overall context of American modernism, and to refute the stereotypes, the pigeonholing that many tribes have had to endure, mostly because of movies and TV and the media defining what the culture is, rather than from outside the Native culture. So that's our major concern. We work for the preservation of our archives, again, which is also the basic idea for today's discussion. And then I also work doing similar work in a way at our museum, the Shinnecock Nation Museum, to try to communicate the accurate dramatic history that we have to present and to preserve, again, steering clear of the stereotypes, that define the culture really in a distorted way. So that's basically it as an introduction. Thanks a lot.
And I have to agree with David, because with our museum, we try to use the message that we're trying to present and how we have things displayed, how we have things organized, is that we're trying to tell our story the way we were there, so how it happened. And at the end, I usually, if I'm giving a tour, will come to the group and be, now, does a lot of the things you've watched from, cowboy Indian movies, does that sound like what the Haudenosaunee were and how we would exist and develop our marriages between other tribes, our vast network of trade, and the fact that we can be found as south as like past North Carolina, and then even further with touches down to close to Florida, and then again having a very big stronghold again north as further than Quebec, and then seeing pockets of our communities even out in Wisconsin where it is that today. So I mean, you don't really get there without being a people that listen and just want better for everyone. So a lot of the times, it's nothing I have a problem with. It's just kind of going through the stereotypes, the misconceptions, because these are the things that are presented for generations. So it's hard to ever get someone that has a good understanding of who we really are and not have like hundreds of years of the whitewashing of our history. And so even this morning, I try to watch, fun TikToks and have the algorithm be puppies and just nerd stuff. But I had a guy from Lake George talking about how we were warring people and how we scalped and how we pushed other people out of the way. It's just so disheartening that it's just like everything he said was completely inaccurate and just, hurtful. But that's the propaganda of a nation trying to demonize a people that were literally just peaceful. Even to the point where, like I said, when we intermarried, that's why you saw maybe some religions change over time is because the ideas were being shared, and we were doing it by becoming the family. And then if so, when you see those changes, archaeologists are now within the last few years really changing that narrative and saying that, oh no, they were intermarrying, they weren't pushing people away, they were becoming so dominant culture wise that that's what's happened. And that and those are the things that we try to help here when we do museum tours or when people ask us the straightforward questions. But yeah, that's something that we like to take head on, just because the more I learn and the more I even learn about my own history, and the more I get to engage with elders, is that we have a beautiful culture. Our society is one that persevered so much, and I just want to make sure I'm representing that the best I can. So it is my honor always to like tell people, it's like, no, we were much more loving and really at the end of the day, happy-go-lucky people.
Justin, that was awesome. And David, thanks for that. Justin, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the complexities of Native America in the 21st century. I know when you and I talked about it, we talked a lot about inter and intra-tribal relationships. We talked about things like the attack on Ikwa right now in front of the Supreme Court. We talked about generational trauma. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that. And when you're done, if you could pass it to David to talk a little bit about truth and reconciliation and what that reckoning and repair looks like in the context of Native art and the way that we keep records.
Yeah, I feel like I came along in a pivot point. It was like I was born in '84. My father was raised in a household that was very pro community, pro CCAHA. He was learning Mohawk until they had to move to where the work was, which was Syracuse. And a little more backstory, that became a problem because knowing Nora Cree, she was taken too as a child and brought to a school a little bit further away from Akwesasne to fix her speech impediment, which was a lighter version of an industrial school, but that still traumatized her so much because her father was sent to Carlisle University and removed for years and came home a different person. And if you don't know how traumatic that is for the youth coming home and not having not being able to be even recognized that from their family or even their friends that they had, and the community didn't know what to do with them. So again, not to go to it'd be, we could talk about that all day too, but that's a lot of trauma and that's a lot of disconnect that my great grandfather had to bring with him. And that was also passed down to my grandmother, who was then had it done to herself. And so when it came to my father growing up in a white school in Syracuse, she just made sure that it was no CCAHA was spoken, no more was taught, no more was like, you have to blend in. I do not want to lose my only son. She was so scared to lose her only child to the system, to another school that would make him fix him, that she under pressure of generations of trauma and assimilation and cultural genocide just stopped everything because she loved her only son that she had. And so my father growing up just had a happy as you can. His father and mother loved him very much. He met my mom pretty young, had 2 boys, then 8 years later, 2 more boys, in which I was the first out of the second batch. And my dad was an iron worker. So even if like the language was there for us to share from him, he was on the road a lot. But it was only until like I was probably in high school where he was home a lot to kind of start asking some of these questions that school was never presenting. Like I brought up one day, like, hey, you ever heard of like industrial schools? It's like, yeah, your great grandfather is in a picture with Jim Thorpe right here. And my mind was like blown. I'm like, oh, that is the most like interesting thing. And I knew that my dad carried a lot of it, but he also hid a lot of it because of that trauma from like, he was such a good son to his mother that he wouldn't like, he didn't want to bring that to us either. So even though I grew up in Akwesasne, it was really hard to collect my heritage from my Mohawk side. So, but growing up in this in the territory, I've seen like every passing year, Like, I feel like that's why I said I was at the pivot point, because after me, it seems like we really felt the boot off our neck. And culturally, we've been able to decolonize more and regain our culture and find out who we really are. And so in the last like 30, 40 years, we've been really able to push back and celebrate our culture. And, you know, as of today, we have so many great organizations, language organizations, youth organizations that are just focused on trying to, you know, reestablish our community as, you know, Ungwe Hungwe versus American or Canadian, which is then an issue because that's where it starts spinning a little bit into so much complexity, because we mentioned ICWA earlier is under attack, and currently a bill passed in 2019 in Canada called C-92, an act respecting First Nations, and there's a fuller name to it. So it was basically designed after ICWA, and it was there to protect Indigenous families and letting them make decisions for ourselves versus being taken. Parallel-wise, Canada, you know, they're famous for their 60 scoop, where it was a abusive system where they were taking children from their families under the slightest fractions. And that didn't stop until like the 80s. Their industrial schools ran until the 90s. And so, and this act was only, again, passed in 2019, where at least ICWA came much sooner than that over here. So there's trades off, because it seems like Canada went harder and longer on taking us from our parents, but they're also the ones that at least are saying truth and reconciliation is coming into and played in their federal government. Where in the United States, I don't feel like we have an inkling of any movement there. And unfortunately, I mean, as I look today, seeing that like Florida won't even teach like, you know, what basic history that's, you know, puts America in a bad light. I can't imagine this federal government here accepting any kind of truth and reconciliation, saying that they were wrong for what they did to the Indigenous people in America. So I, a lot of people, a lot of the community I have, some definitely that were raised in the Canadian portions and know more of it. They say that's just not enough. There's some people over here that would be like, well, at least it's something. But at the end of the day, it is like it's such a contrast thing that between the US and Canada, that they have a similar history, because like the industrial schools that started here were modeled in Canada, that were modeled in Australia, then were brought to New Zealand. So it was like a system that like was replicated to deal with their Indigenous populations. So a lot what we see happen in our history on the American side of it, we see like a reflection in Canada. But then again, there is some differences, because certain countries will get over it faster. Truth and reconciliation, I know in Australia and New Zealand, are much further along than we are here in North America. Sorry, I just will pause there and let anyone who wants to speak.
David, do you want to talk about any of the these complexities around Amerinda in your work? And I know we're going to hear from you a lot more in a little bit, but did you want to add anything about these complexities of 21st century Native America?
Yes, I'd just like to also comment in a similar way to Mr. Cree just mentioning a little terms of background, which kind of sets the stage on what we deal with today. For example, my grandfather, I had two grandfathers from two parts of the country. My mother's father was Chiricahua Apache, and they were held prisoners of war for 23 years. They were released only in 1914. And at that time, a lot of the tribe died because of being held prisoners of war and were taken away from their homeland, which is in southeastern Arizona. So he was raised with Geronimo's group there at Fort Sill, and he wound up wanting to, actually, he was older. So even though that was the middle part of the time where there was so much tragedy of removal of children from the Native people's homes, he decided to go to Hampton Institute, which was a boarding school, military school in Hampton, Virginia. But he wound up playing football, and he was also a lecturer, and he was a performer of Native American songs. Many of the tribes, peoples here that came to New York City were actually engaged in traditional dancing and singing. It actually became professional showbiz people because that was the way that they helped them to survive in many difficult times. And when they came to this part of the country, they continued to, it wasn't something they did to pretend anything. It was a part of their traditional culture that they were able to do for the general public, and they were able to survive on performing Native singing and dancing in various languages. That's what my grandfather began doing, did that for many years. So the other side of my great grandfathers were from Shinnecock Montauk people. And of course, they had been in contact with the European colonists here for 300 years by the time the early 20th century came around. And my great grandfather, one of them was a professional guide and a hunter, for example. And he had many well-known clients, such as people, Teddy Roosevelt's sons, and some of these people who were the super wealthy, rich people who came out to the East End of Long Island, and hunting in the early 20th century was very, shorebird hunting was quite some activity for a lot of these people. And that was one of my great grandfathers, one of the best in the East Coast for that type of work, because they were it wasn't far removed from their traditional lifestyle at that time of the early 20th century. And his brother, actually, believe it or not, played in the second U.S. Open golf tournament here in Shinnecock Hills golf course in Southampton. So some of the Native peoples in some of these times were engaged in very unique activities, which kind of again refutes the idea that there was a monolithic, looking at Native people as a monolithic way, that we all were doing the same thing. We all were pretty much similar. And there were very interesting differences, I must say, just in cultural activity and so forth. So the other thing I would mention that as well, though, too, is that, of course, in the archival history area here in the United States, there was a program set up by the National Park Service called the Historic Preservation Program, in which tribal nations, it was a way, I suppose, of being intermediaries between political tribal nations' concerns in preserving cultural resources and the federal government. I was a historic preservation officer briefly for my tribe, and what we did was try to preserve our so-called cultural resources, whether they be buildings, water resources, grave sites. And I might say in New York State, I think is still probably one of the only states in the United States that does not protect Native American graves, grave sites, even if it's on private property. We had a lot of burial sites disturbed on Long Island that were not protected because they were on so-called private property. And I just mentioned that because that's, of course, a very important topic to the Shinnecock Nation. I'm not empowered really to talk about Shinnecock Nation level areas, but I would say that the Historic Preservation Program was intended to be an intercessory go-between between the nation, the federal government, and the federal agencies that are doing developments of one kind or another, whether it be buildings, development proposals, that would disturb Native resources, whether they be archival or any other kind of historic resource that should be preserved for religious reasons, spiritual reasons, or cultural reasons. We've also been very much engaged with NAGPRA Native American graves and repatriation process. I worked in that myself as well. And again, because you have a great, there's still too much of a difference in terms of how these things, these issues are dealt with, because there's no overarching mandate to you could call it reconciliation, but in terms of institutions receiving federal funds, repatriating materials, if they can get away with it, a lot of times they will try to, or they'll try to keep materials that should never have wound up in museums, whether NAGPRA's in place or not. So there's usually still a tug of war between the tribal nation and the institution that has, Native collections, unfortunately. And so again, the Historic Preservation Program was intended to be an intermediary, between the cultural institution, the federal agency, and the tribal nation itself. Sometimes you have very good successes. If the development agency is willing to work with the tribe, in many cases, they couldn't care less, they want to do what they want to do. And at least in one case is that they were mandated supposedly to pay the tribal nation if they wanted to do some development on tribal land or do some destructive something to tribal resources. But in many cases, they didn't want to pay anybody, they didn't want to pay the tribes, even though the federal government was supposed to sort of incentivize the agencies to paying the tribes, you see. So it's very complex, but in any case, that's just a few other things I put on the table if people have never heard of some of these activities. So thanks, thank you.
Thank you both
Yeah,
so much.
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin. Yeah, last word on this from you.
Yeah, I just
Go ahead.
want to say about our sovereignty too, just like getting our wolf belt back from Albany took quite a few years. And even when they were told they had to, we had to wait to eventually someone retired to get back our wolf belt. And that is, we use that a lot on our tours because it's a way to show that when we get a lot of accusations like, well, everything's in the past, just get over it. Well, no, this wolf belt was possibly the forerunner of the 1796 treaty we have, which we're currently dealing with our land claims as of right now. Like I'm living in a land claim zone in the neighboring town Messina, that if we do get remedies through the court, just like Oneida has already set the precedent, that I can be able to pay off my mortgage and then give the deed to the tribe, and I become Akwesasne West, which is, again, in our tour, I show that not only is this like current and important to us, but this wolf belt is like reaching almost like 300 years into the future to like give us our ability to claim what little land we can get back. So I just wanted to say that, again, getting those repatriation, our culture, these artifacts back too. And yeah, unfortunately it is true. It's very in New York State history elsewhere too, that, the grave sites were just unabashedly just picked over clean at certain points. So it is something I want to say too, that is very, very tragic. And the more you hear about it, the more we find out that what used to be is gone from us completely. It's hard to imagine however we can recover.
Yeah, thank you both for that. And we were talking about this before the webinar started, when all the panelists were together and the co-facilitators, and we had talked about, we're just going to send the resources to you all later, but I do just want to shout out, we have these amazing resources put together by Colette, Justin, and David and my team that are really like dig into that topic of repatriation, that topic of repatriation, like, and building relationships so that we can be respectful of each other and do the right thing. Also information about land sovereignty and other types of Indigenous sovereignty. So thanks everybody for lifting that up. I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Justin so we can talk about, we can start our conversation about grounding our work in relationship. And again, the slides are very minimal, but Justin's going to talk to us about what it takes to build relationship, boundaries. We're going to talk a little bit about language, and we actually have a question already about language. So I think after Justin and David share their pieces, maybe we can go to this question and then go to Colette, because she has quite a bit to share with us about what the Iroquois Museum does. Every time I talked to David, he had talked about asking and like reaching out and asking the Native community. So he's going to talk to us about that. And he's also going to talk a little bit more about boundaries. So Justin, I'm going to pass you the mic to kick off this conversation about grounding our work and relationship.
Guess it's because it's right there, boundaries. It's such a good way to start. Like our community varies because of, in the last, like again, in my lifetime, I've seen things definitely lighten up, but especially with community members who feel like any kind of culture related classes we do, any how we teach our language, how we teach our stories should be kept solely with our community, no base outsiders. So there is that point, and I've seen it in the last few decades, like really kind of lighten up, but this was a trauma response from everything being taken from us. So a lot of our longhouse clan mothers and chiefs felt like it was really important that it be just community members only. So when we offer classes at time to respect that and to respect the teacher that wants to give us the time and help us give back to our community, we do have to limit who can come to a class because of the of what we're able to do. But then there's other classes that are just open to everyone. And so there is that balance, even as a very kind of like, we feel like the Akwesasne Culture Center is a neutral site, but we also have to respect a lot of our community members who feel adamant that we still need to make sure that our culture is protected. But then on the other end, we have so many great the other spectrum is that we have people here all the time. We have a local artist has his first children's book coming out next month, and we're happy to do like a big book event. So it's this, and he's doing a story about kind of like the tortoise and the hare, but it's the tortoise and the beaver. So it's the same story. It's like about that the turtle being a little bit cleverer than the beaver. So it's we're very excited about it. And language over time in my lifetime has become such a thing because going to a school, you don't really get much Native information until you start really integrating myself with my community. And then you see that like the term Indian really is just, it's falling on, even growing up, it was something that our community wanted to get rid of because we were not that. And then Native American sometimes still doesn't, people feel like that's not a good way to describe communities because we were here before America. And then First Nations was very, was the one gaining traction, I think about the time I was in college, because at least recognize that these are First Nation people. These were the First Nations. And it goes to like what David was saying about how we're not a monolith. We were like hundreds of unique, specific cultures. And it's kind of like saying that to just throw Europe all together on one culture, like one monolith, you can't. There's so many, again, it's a little bit of a gross injustice to say that we were all just one people. And just the moving in, I think really what's been landing, what I think a lot of people are just using more and more is just Indigenous, is saying like, Indigenous people, Indigenous language. It just seems like that terminology seems to be the one winning out. And I think I saw a little bit of the question asked earlier about the Haudenosaunee, and that I will kind of explain myself a little bit more, is that means the people of the Longhouse. And originally that was 5 nations, which we were just one of the 5 nations. We were the keepers of the Eastern Door, as the Mohawk, or at least how we would call ourselves in that section as a Ginagahaga. But we call ourselves Ogwe because what we mean is like original people. So it's kind of like how you would call yourself. So we're just one part of the Haudenosaunee. And so a lot of that time is just trying to reclaiming our space, reclaiming our identity, is that we don't want Iroquois anymore, because that's, when you look at the root of it, it's a French word for another tribe, and for another tribe they were calling snakes. So they kind of they're calling us snakes, but they got but they were calling someone else snakes. So it's in twofold. It's double insulting. So we don't have any reverence for that word, and a lot of our organizations are just have been and are currently switching over just to renaming ourselves, putting new signage out. Last summer, the Haudenosaunee national lacrosse team just said we're dropping that. We're not that anymore. We are the Haudenosaunee. So it's things like that we're just kind of taking in. Mohawk's not a term that we shy away from, but it's just not a great term because, again, like I said, it doesn't show up in our language. So that's why we're working on kind of moving that when if people just putting out their unwehunwe or when we say we speak CCAHA, that's this are terms that we're moving toward. But in respect to if someone calls us Mohawk, that's fine. It's just different levels. Like we definitely are trying to move to Haudenosaunee, where even our community in Akwesasne that are Mohawk community, we're still fine with it. It's just like it's not, it's just not the best term to really describe us. So in time we'll probably see something we'll land on that might work better. But for now, that's kind of just where we're at with at least how we identify ourselves. And being in Akwesasne, we're just one of the communities in the North Country that have Mohawk identity. Our community accepts, we do have like, if you're from Oneida or Six Nations, we have families that come there. So we're not just exclusionary. We're just, we're one of the many inclusive reservations that will take in, other Haudenosaunee. Our sister kind of territory, when we talk about it, is Kahnawake next to Montreal. So there's a lot of cultural sharing, and we like, and it's family right there too. So Akwesasne itself is not the only Mohawk reservation in the area. I'm just trying to find trying to put some of these bigger things into perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I just wanted to jump in because we have a question asking, we have a few questions, so we're going to get to those, but I just wanted to say to the person who asked, can you see the spelling of some of these names? I will say yes, we will happily send you spellings of some of the words and place names that Justin and David are sharing. I will just say that the language that Justin is saying the names in is transliterated. And so it's the sound combinations are approximated when you see them. And when you've grown up speaking English and you're not immersed in the language, I'll say that it's very hard for English speaking ears to get. And I know this because I have close people to me who speak that language regularly, and they have to like record themselves so that I can say things correctly when we're together. So it like truly is like a very complex, beautiful language, and it will be about as close as like when we transliterate something from Korean or Russian or something like that. So you should expect it to be like not exact, but close, as close as we can get with the way that we use English. So Justin,
Like
I don't know if you wanted to say
like with
anything more about it. Yeah, go ahead.
Akwesasne. Oh, sorry, like with Akwesasne, I always put like aqua as in water, then sauce like hot sauce, and then knee like your knee, like the joint. So if you go aqua, sauce, knee, Akwesasne gets you close to that. But there's a lot of shame even in my entire life of not knowing how to speak CCAHA, because again, that was something taken away from me, and it's taken me a long time to realize it's not my fault, it's not my father's fault. And a lot of community members will come to me as like, you don't feel shameful, just take it like how you eat a whale, a bite at a time. And it's the best thing about starting here almost a year ago was like, great, I have the next 30 years to get really good at my own language, so. And then the non-native part of my heritage, I have a little French grandma that didn't speak me the Quebecois, so I guess I really should be trilingual, but I'll work on that.
That's great. Thanks. David, I want to pass the mic to you and ask you to talk about, specifically, you and I had some really great conversations about just ask, and also being respectful of boundaries set by Indigenous communities around us. So I wondered if you could speak to that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, there's about 2-3 areas to hit that maybe people hadn't considered one as basic as just ask the Native community, whether you're talking about an individual, whether you're talking about an institution, tribe, it doesn't really matter. Ask if you're a non-Indian entity, a foundation, a philanthropist, somebody with a kind heart that thinks they want to try to help, so-called help Native Americans. Ask them what they need. What do they need help at this time? What is it that you have in mind? And don't come in and try to be, overbearing about what it is that you think this is going to be a fantastic benefit, fantastic program. The Indian people, the Native people should just automatically want to accept a lot of money, for example. People sometimes are very well-meaning, but they think money will solve every single thing. And where the Native community has been, so disrespected and walked on for so long that it's a very damaging thing to come in and try to dictate to Native people what they should and shouldn't do if they feel like they have a lot of resources to offer. So ask the Native people what they need. There's certain things, practical things that maybe they could use, then try to help them in that regard. I bring everyone's attention to a very interesting book, Custer Died for Your Sins. It's an older book, now came out in the 60s, by Vine Deloria. And he makes a point in there, a basic point at about the early, 1950s, going back to the 50s here in the country, where anthropologists, non-Native anthropologists would love to come to Indian Native reservations and come in and say they're going to save everybody's culture. They say, well, we know your language is this, you're in a fragile state. We want to help you save your culture, right? And what happens is, in a short way, is that they try to define. It's another area, another opportunity to define Native culture, even though they're not raised in it. They really don't know what they're doing. And sometimes the Native people would believe in what these anthropologists said. Oh, they're great scholars. They have all these credentials. They know what they're talking about. Maybe we should change and follow what they want, And of course, the traditional people will say, well, they don't know what they're talking about. They went ahead and preserved their culture anyway. But it could be a very damaging thing. In the art world, you find this by scholars, so-called scholars, critics, writers, curators who are non-Indian, who came in and wanted to very much to define Native arts, to create a whole archetype, in many cases with a lot of distortions in it, because they thought, well, the Native arts fit in this category, or they fit in another category. So instead of Native people defining their own culture for themselves, the critics would do this for us. One way of going against that, we're always saying we need more Native writers, need more curators, need more people who can express and share the language from our viewpoint to the larger world. Otherwise, we're going to be defined by others right out of existence, And we wrote a book, it was published in 2017, called No Reservation, New York Contemporary Native American Art Movement. Again, in order to try to set the record straight by those of us that lived a lot of this history directly. It's from expressing the culture from within the culture and not from without, not try to self-define ourselves. Otherwise, others are going to come right in and define who we are, and we won't even have anything to say about it. That's what has gone on in too many cases. So that's the first thing. Ask the Native people what they need. Maybe they do need practical help, and it may not be what you think they should use, but that's what it is. That's respect. That's being respectful. Another thing is, don't try to define Native people. Ask them, how did they define themselves? Ask them directly. Don't create something that is not, that's false. And you find that in early years too of the contemporary Native American art movements, where a lot of the European artists, modern artists, thought they understood Native art, and they inserted themselves into the descriptions of what they thought the Native people were trying to do and communicate. And in many cases, it was not accurate at all. So I just mentioned that in passing. I recommend Custard Died for Your Sins. And finally, there are a lot of publications you find online. There's a monograph written by Jennifer R. O'Neill regarding Vine Deloria, again, talking about, it's called The Right to Know, Decolonizing Native American Archives. So archives, again, has been used as a political tool, again, to disenfranchise Native nations as they're struggling and have been struggling to maintain themselves. The control of the administrative control through documents, treaties, agreements. If the Native people can't find their own papers, that's a big problem. And Deloria is trying to say again, what is the protocol? You should have a good protocol of respect when dealing with Native Americans, especially when you're talking about administrative archives, records, because these are some of the things that have been used to destroy Native peoples too, getting their records. And it's gone as high as the BIA. They went ahead and lost records for 30 years. They say, oh, we don't know what happened to them, you know, and this is the high level now, from the nation to nation level. They lost records that were pertinent to payments, for example, that the federal government and supposed to be, again, the BIA is supposed to be intermediary between the oil companies, for example, and the nations. Well, they went ahead and so-called lost all the records for I don't know how long. So that's an old strategy, you know, to somehow lose records and nobody knows what the heck happened, you know, when all of this took place. Thank heavens you have a few elders who have institutional memory, you know, in some of the tribal governments, whether you're talking museums or whatever, who remembers they were there, you know, when stuff was being stolen and lost and what have you. So that's all there is to that. And I just wanted to mention that quickly. Thank you.
Thanks. David is actually going to talk to us quite a bit more in sort of like the last big section that we're doing around like record keeping. So because he's, you know, from an archive. So before we get there though, I want to toss it over to Colette because the Iroquois Museum has sort of a formula that they developed, or a template. I don't know what to call it, a formula, a template, I'm not sure, but a really cool way of doing Native and non-Native relationship building and fortification. And so I want to toss that over to Colette to talk us through.
Thank you. Thank you. It's just to jump off of what David was saying, basically we're working out of at a disadvantage in a way from the very beginning in terms of museums and relationships with Indigenous people. You know, the early museums were established, the objects from a culture were collected by non-natives and then interpreted by non-natives. And there's this immense imbalance of power and control over those materials and over the story. So that in any engagements that we were beginning to have as an anthropology museum, that was kind of a foundational hurdle that we have to recognize and get beyond. I've been around forever. I've worked for the past 30 years with both as a consultant to tribal museums, Haudenosaunee tribal museums, as well as non-Native museums. And in my capacity here, when I stopped and stepped back and tried to think of, you know, we're in a position now where we're basically, I'll be retiring, our director will be retiring, and trying to think of how to set up to continue this museum beyond into the future, and what good guidelines would be for staff coming in. And one of the three things that I came up with And there's definitely some overlap with what Justin and David were saying. Is the first one, of course, is respect. The second is reciprocity. And the third one is relevance. And with those three principles in mind, they really help rein us, they help guide our decision-making processes. And they hopefully keep us in good, strong standing with Haudenosaunee communities. We actually we try to work with our collection, which I didn't say before. Our collection is predominantly focused on contemporary Haudenosaunee art, which we began the collection in the early 1980s to today. So that is most of what we work with material-wise. The idea of respect, of course, extends to the objects and materials that we care for, but it also, of course, extends to the culture and the individuals that we work with one-on-one on a daily basis. Listening is massive, massively important. We have PhDs, we have master's degrees. We're all, we think of ourselves as being very knowledgeable. And we are about our professions, but we need to step back and listen to the Haudenosaunee people who are involved in various capacities in our institution. And that also leads to building trust, and building trust takes a long time. And trust gets broken down equally as easily. And so establishing trust with the Indigenous people you're working with has to occur. And then once it occurs, it has to be maintained. And so that is one of the things that guides us. I would say, and again, with respect, is really consider the language that you're using. Listen to how individuals refer to themselves and to the materials that are the expressions of their culture. The outfits and regalia that Indigenous people create and wear are not costumes. And the word does not mean the same thing, although we might think it does. If you step back and really analyze what those words mean, they're very, very different. Haudenosaunee people belong to nations. They generally don't refer to themselves as tribes. It's a very distinctly different image, and it means something very different. Learn to say people's names. The language, the Iroquois languages are really, really hard for an English speaker. My husband teases me that I speak English as a third language. It is the words, some of the people's names, the artists that we work with, they have very long names. I have to syllabalize them out and tape them to my dashboard and practice them driving back and forth to work. And even then I struggle with the names, but that doesn't mean that it's not necessary. It shows a certain level of respect that those names are very important to people. Another component of what we keep in the forefront of our decision-making is the idea of reciprocity. And hospitality. And one of the reasons I think it's so important is because those two components, those two elements, those two ideas are already so foundational to Haudenosaunee culture that if we bring them to our actions and our interactions with Haudenosaunee Indigenous people, it's a common language. It's recognition that these things are important. And as opposed to what I would describe as very extractive, where traditionally when you would interview or speak with or work with an Indigenous person, it's easy to come from the position of, this is what we need as a museum. We need this from you, as opposed to, yes, we would like to have this information. We want to share it with our visitors, but on the other hand, what are we giving back? It's not one-sided. And so as a small organization, we're constantly trying to come up with creative ways to give something back to the communities and the individuals that we work with, and on a small budget. We often draw from the expertise of our own staff. I mean, a lot of my expertise is in grants and writing. I'm a good writer. And so, you know, we've done things like offer grant writing assistance to Native organizations, to artists who are applying for grants. We have our collections, our contemporary collection is completely online and very accessible. It's also very physically accessible. If somebody comes here and wants to, they just come and they're like, want to see something that their grandma made, or see if we have anything by their uncle. And we make sure that happens. And we've loaned exhibits to some of the tribal museums. We get calls for advice on, or suggestions or recommendations on museum policy, museum practices. You know, how do you do your database? What database do you use? Conservation techniques, things like that. And we're very much a clearinghouse for. We get a lot of phone calls from individuals across the state who want to bring Haudenosaunee people into their setting for some reason. And we do a ton of matchmaking where we're like, okay, where are you and what are you looking for, and things like that. And we also do a lot of front-end education when we make that connection. One of the things that we did in terms of reciprocity, which was really fun, was last summer. And we're gonna really try to do more of this if we can, because it was very successful, is we were invited to set up at the Akwesasne Children's Powwow. And we went up and we had a little tabletop display, but we also brought 3 children's activities with the materials and take-home things. And we spent all day making things with Haudenosaunee families. And it was wonderful on our end because we learned a lot. But we also, instead of just showing up with our hands out, we brought something to the table. We did something that actually contributed. This is a very community-based event, and we brought something to that. We hope we did that helped to make that event more successful by bringing these activities for the kids. And we're hoping that, you know, our director is very frugal, so she's not going to let us spend too much money traveling, but we're hoping we can just, maybe next year we'll go to the Tuscarora picnic, which again is very community based. And if we're welcome there, we'll do the same thing. We'll bring all kinds of kids stuff and do that, and just try to travel around Iroquois country doing that. The other piece of reciprocity really has to do with representation, and representation definitely has to mean more than just token representation. We can't, you don't have one Haudenosaunee person on your board and say, we did it, we're done. We've really tried very hard to invite Haudenosaunee input into various capacities of our museum doings. We have Iroquois on our board, we have Haudenosaunee on our staff, and we hire Haudenosaunee consultants and curators and demonstrating artists. We are very far from any Haudenosaunee community. The closest one is Oneida, is 3 hours away or so. Akwesasne is at least 4 hours away. So we have to work very hard to ensure that there is this kind of representation in our museum. But it goes without saying, it has to happen. Without this, we have absolutely no integrity. And so we have to make that work. The other aspect of representation is creating, we do a changing contemporary exhibit every year, and that features art from any of the Haudenosaunee communities or people who live outside of the community. And what we really try to do is create a very welcoming, open platform for dialogue and discussion. And where Haudenosaunee voices can be heard and they can speak, even if it makes someone uncomfortable. So, and the third piece is basically, and one reminder, these elements, whatever we're going to call them, these guiding principles, respect, reciprocity, and relevance, we realize they need to be implemented, not just on a personal level, not just me as a curator working with an artist or a demonstrating artist or a consultant. It has to be implemented on an institutional level. Everyone from your bookkeeper to your custodian, to your shop staff. Everybody's got to be on the same page. And they need to understand what's at stake. So the last piece is relevance. And basically, we try to be relevant, like all museums, we try to be relevant to our audiences, which are, in our case, are largely non-native, but we have a responsibility to be relevant to the Haudenosaunee community as well. And as we design things, as we come up with ideas, it's developed out of what is relevant, and we listen. What is relevant to you? And in our exhibitions, we've done a couple that one of the things we can do is we can create a setting where things can be discussed here in this setting that may not be comfortable or welcome or suitable perhaps to be discussed within the community, because they're really hot topics, or it's kind of like we did one exhibit last year or the year before called Identity Identify, and it grew out of years and years of hearing from Haudenosaunee people how difficult of the complexity of what it means to be of mixed race within a culture that is matrilineal, that your heritage is passed through your women, and if you are not, if your mother is not Haudenosaunee, then you're not enrolled. And in many of these communities, the repercussions are significant. And so it's the elephant in the room. Everybody, you know, Haudenosaunee people and other recognize that this exists, but it isn't really talked about a lot. And so we created a setting here where it could be talked about, and we had a panel discussion with a number of the artists. And it was very, it cleared the air, and it was very thoughtful, and that it was very relevant, not only to our audiences, but to the Haudenosaunee artists and community members that were involved. So I think, you know, there are certainly some other, we also did an exhibit on stereotypes, because again, these are things that just proliferate, and it expands out to not just Indigenous people, which is how we made it relevant to our audiences as well. But those are just the three kind of guiding principles that we operate from here. And so far they really help keep us on track.
Colette, thank you so much for that. I'm gonna go ahead and pass the mic over to David, because David is really going to take us into practical applications of Native and non-Native partnerships. He's going to talk about some overarching principles about working together, protocols for working together. He's going to talk about point of view, curatorial point of view, and collection management point of view, also advocacy, and talk to us a little bit about archives, records, and documents. So David, I'm going to pass you the mic. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just a few ideas that I've been involved with regarding curatorial perspectives again, and collections, museum collections we deal with. First thing would be dealing with Native American museums. There's a difference, kind of as a follow-up too, as to what Ms. Lemon was talking about, you know, in terms of collections. There's usually a different policy. When you're talking about Native American museums, they have a different conceptual idea with the museum and the way that collections are managed. And that has been my experience. Collections management policies reflect the more of the traditional mindset usually in terms of what is an object, what is the policy regarding display or handling of that object, how long does it remain, I think it also reflects on the idea of reciprocity, as you were just talking about. For example, in the ordinary museum, once the object has been accessioned and it becomes so-called property of the museum, it would be unthinkable to repatriate it or return it back to the tribe from which it came. This would just be unheard of. Some of my experience in larger institutional museums, I mean, they're very, the mindset, the conceptual mindset is very much more materialistic, unless they're working directly with a tribal nation that might be in close physical, proximity to the museum. I mean, they have no choice, the federal mandate is that if they receive federal funding, they're supposed to, in many cases, be proactive in repatriating materials, providing that the tribe can substantiate their ownership. There's a lot of things that are used in order to put the Native people to a disadvantage. Sometimes it's overburdensome paperwork in terms of the tribe supposedly proving that they are the owners or originators of the material before the museum would even return it. A lot of the conservators, people who deal directly with the items in the museum collections, tend to be very materialistic. They have the scientific ethic and that everything is just an object to be handled and to be manipulated, in order to preserve it, so-called, to put it on display or to, keep it forever in storage. And of course, the traditional mindset, most first priority dealing with medicine items or items that are used in ceremonial contexts that the museum has usually acquired, not with consent of the tribe involved in many cases, but if it's not to that level, but it might be so-called community property, something that would be used to the tribe, in which case the policy should reflect the idea that an item may not necessarily be intended to be preserved forever, but it could actually be used, continued to be used by tribal members. For example, we have some headdresses in our museum that are really just there for storage. The chiefs can use them if they want to in ceremonial context, use them and then return them back into storage in the museum. Other items are supposed to be returned back to the tribes because they have sacred items in there, whether it's feather work, feathers, so forth, or something is central to their religion. These things are being repatriated. In many cases, medicine people would be invited to come to the museum and conduct ceremonies so that the item can be maintained correctly. A lot of these items are seen as being alive. They have a life force there. It's not something that's just an inanimate object, that can be preserved. In many cases, the traditional use of an object was not intended to be stored forever. It was intended to be used for its purpose and then returned back to the earth or allowed to fulfill its life cycle, and then that would be it. Was not intended to be put under a glass case forever. These are some of the policy differences and conceptual philosophical differences. Another interesting thing is that in museums, of course, for years ago, the concept of a museum was sort of a European idea, I believe. Many of the museum, the image of the Native person, the culture depicted, was usually shown to a disadvantage. The clothing would not show all of the beautiful exquisite handwork that would be involved. You know, they usually show the Native person as being underclothed in many cases, you know, with very little clothing on. In which people, European-minded people would say, well, these people don't have, don't have a lot of material culture there. They don't have a lot of beautiful handwork, you know, with materials they use. So I was taught in working with some of the Native consultants who do this for a living more than I do, the higher level, especially the people who are bringing back the traditional lifestyle today that we had 300 years ago. The idea is to always show the Native people to the best advantage and not do things that are half-hearted, you know, and always show and let people know that we had very, very high level, exquisite handmade work that is very difficult even to reproduce today. Another funny difference conceptually is that Native people in many cases who are into doing non-Native people, I'm sorry, that want to recreate so-called arts, Native arts, they have a funny idea of being perfectionists. You know, they think that if Native people don't create art using all the original materials and tools and methods that they had 300, 400, 500 years ago, then they're kind of being not loyal to their own cultures, you know, and you find non-Native so-called experts being upset that Native people want to use modern tools today. It's really funny, I think, to the Native tribes and artisans, because they say, well, if our ancestors didn't have, for example, a miniature chainsaw, don't you think they'd have used it to carve with, you know? Why would they go and try to say, no, we're going to continue to use the tools that would make it the most difficult or the most laborious, you might say, for us? So there's always a place for that. But it's funny because, again, it's a person outside the culture that wants to define the mores and the belief system of the Native culture today, you know, and they say, well, you're not being loyal to the way your ancestors did it, and all this kind of funny stuff, you know. So that's all a part of the climate of Native cultural image in museums and collections. And again, it's serious business. The repatriation is very serious because it's still ongoing, you know, and it has a lot of implications to it, political and otherwise. When you're dealing with human remains, when you're dealing with, you contemplate how a lot of these things were acquired initially from the tribes themselves. I'm talking about, for example, the old Museum of the American Indian in New York City, the High Foundation. A lot of these materials were not obtained with the direct permission of the people who they came. They just acquired them many times illegally. So they go ahead and they assume that they have the right to do anything they want to with these objects. And it's not the case, you know. So that's little curatorial ideas. I would say it goes back again to art, traditional contemporary Native American art, where you have people usually have the idea it's not Native American art if it's not a piece of pottery, it's not beadwork, it's not a rug, it's not something woven. So they're conflating more traditional types of work with more contemporary Native work, which is usually painting, sculpture, things that are more aligned with modernistic technique that also has its place, has its own genre, you know. So people will look at a painting, right, and they don't see an Indian with a headdress on. They say, well, that's not a Native art. You crazy? What are you looking at? One of the things that one of our founders of a New York movement tried to get into, he was one of the first to do it, Lloyd Oxendine, the Lumbee Nation, was that he wanted contemporary Native American art to be accepted in the overall world of American modernism or American art canon, and not be pigeonholed or segregated into its own area. Artists are free to do that if they wish, but a lot of the artists that were coming to New York at that time wanted their work accepted as art. The Native aspect or the Native personality was there, if it's made by a native person, it's native, right? It doesn't have to look like it's native, quote unquote, whatever that means, you see. So that is another very deadly thing, because you have the outside critic who has defined native contemporary art for generations. It's only been recently that it's been acknowledged that many of the modernist genre techniques and styles had been acquired by and been copied from native ideas, native designs. It's not only Native American, indigenous people from the Western Hemisphere, it's African, Southeast Asian, indigenous arts all over the world. The design elements and styles and everything, the philosophies have been copied and emulated by many of the abstract artists who first came from Europe after World War II. And some of these artists freely acknowledge this, but the curators, they were not so willing to acknowledge the indigenous influence on many of the so-called American modernism and whatever movement they happen to be talking about. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you.
David, thanks so much for that. I'm going to toss it right over to Colette, who's going to talk about it from the Iroquois Museum's perspective. So Colette, to you.
So, I mean, what I wanted to do is interestingly, although we've been around 40 years, and our gallery, our contemporary gallery changes every year, sometimes twice a year. On the other hand, the other side of our museum and the other focus that the museum has is on archaeology, specifically Schoharie County archaeology. That particular section of our museum has not been changed since 1992 when we moved into this building. And of course, it's way outdated. It's outdated in terms of its presentation style. It's outdated in terms of the information. So we decided we need to redo the archaeology section. And that turned out we started the process by inviting two Haudenosaunee consultants to sit with us and look at what we had and help us to determine, number one, if we needed to change the storyline or just needed to change the presentation style. It turned out to be quite an afternoon. I was totally not prepared for, I had worked with one of the consultants before and in multiple capacities. So I was very confident we were going to have a very, a respectful conversation. It was very hard. What we hadn't realized was how we have many stakeholders in this process. We had archaeologists who were part of the team. We had anthropologists. We had museum professionals, more museum people like me, more into the and then we had the Haudenosaunee consultants. It was very, very difficult. The archaeologist and the founding director felt in the discussion was very direct. It was highly critical of what we had there. And, one thing after another that we absolutely had, it was downright offensive. And that was what our takeaway message was. And so as a result of that conversation, as the afternoon went on, our archaeologists and our founding director got very defensive. The Haudenosaunee folks who were there were also very uncomfortable, and we just kept trying to talk it out. In the end, we learned a lot about this exhibit and what needed to happen to redo or reimagine this space. One of the problems we knew we had, or I recognized that perhaps archaeologists kind of, I'm going to go ahead and say it, they really operate in a little bubble where it's really all about the objects and a lot less about the people. And they have trouble letting go of that. And they have trouble letting go of the archaeological scholarly language, which in no way is how Haudenosaunee person would think of these objects. And so it was it was a very, very difficult undertaking. We are not at all, it's a work in progress. So we, as much as we've done a lot of good work in the art side of things, this latest endeavor is a lot more of a challenge, because it's really this push and pull about whose voice is going to come, whose voice is going to carry the storyline. We have realized that, I mean, some of the things we took away were, first of all, we had the choice of language was really problematic. It was very dated. It was words that if you took any Anthropology 101 class, you grew up hearing, or you heard it in your class. The whole term hunter-gatherers, which we used throughout the exhibit, was really problematic because it really lends itself to the individuals who were just kind of wandering aimlessly around the landscape, which is not at all what First Peoples were doing. We also use the word prehistory. And if you break that out and think about it, it's like, to me, it never bothered me. It's, we're talking about the old days, prehistory. But from a Haudenosaunee perspective, prehistory is what it's really saying is, well, that was before, history started with contact period. You had no history. You had no history before we got here. So that word was, we definitely realized that word carried weight. And it was giving an impression we didn't really want to give. It was offensive. The idea of early peoples, again, something that we all walk through that gallery all the time, and I never was offended by it. I'm not an Indigenous person. It's common language that I was used to. And the idea of early people versus late people, like late meaning like when the culture was dying out kind of thing. It was like a diminishing culture, the early versus late. And our exhibits were laid out in a very linear way. The cases broke everything, it's very logical, and it's very, this is the case that goes from this period to this period. This is the archaic. This is this period to this period. This is early woodland. Haudenosaunee people would never see or describe their existence in the. It didn't end and start and end and start. It's a continuum of occupation on this land and relationship with this place that we were not necessarily illustrating with this exhibit. And so we had a lot of work to do. And the biggest lesson we got from this was, after years, as I said, we opened in '92. This has been up since then. Not one person ever, not one, and we get a lot of Haudenosaunee visitors and people come and go here all the time. No one has ever said anything to us. Maybe no one reads the labels, but what we do realize is that don't assume as an organization that just because no one's complaining that you don't have work to do. And so we came up with a few things that we are definitely we're going to do differently. First of all, what we're looking at the question of, so, okay, we know that the archaeologists and the non-natives value archaeology as a science, but what's the value of archaeology and these materials to Haudenosaunee people? That needs to be part of the story. And we really want to plant some seeds to question this conventional non-native authority in the narrative. In the beginning, we had an outline where at the end we were talking about what are the limitations of archaeology as an interpretive device, and what is this perspective and what is it not? Why is it so limiting? And then also to discuss the issues of repatriation. These are huge. We don't say anything right now about the issues of repatriation in our exhibit, and that is a glaring omission. So first we had that at the end of the story of the archaeological section. And then we decided at the last meeting that that needs to be front and center when our visitors first encounter and enter this space, that they need to know that this is a Western science, and that these things are not facts. This is one interpretation, and that Haudenosaunee individuals would interpret this in a different way. And so we are doing that. We're also emphasizing agency in the human story, as opposed to the presentation now, which is much more passive in terms of as if the environment had, just these people were just totally, these individuals were just totally formed and their lives were controlled by the resources in the environment, as opposed to turning it all completely around and saying these individuals were active participants and in this process and making decisions. And it's more human story than an object-based story, but we still have we have a lot of work to do. And I will be quite honest, I told Aria when we met offline that, when we started this process after that last meeting, I was really hoping that I would retire before this was something that I had to really be address. Because I find myself, I understood what the Haudenosaunee consultants were saying, and I thought it was their method of saying it, perhaps it was a very abrupt. It could have probably been a little more diplomatic, but I got the message. But it's been very hard to try to communicate that message as an intermediary to the other stakeholders in this process on our team, which are the archaeologists and the founding director and the anthropologists on our team. It's very hard, and I'm not sure how successful we'll be, but we're not stopping. We're going to continue to push forward on this because it has to change. So it's not easy. That's all I can say.
Thanks, Kola. I have a question for you. You've talked, I'm not sure if you said this. If you did, I apologize for asking you to repeat it, but you've talked a lot about, working with artists and consultants and stuff. How, do you pay them? Do they volunteer their time? How does your museum handle that?
Well, I mean, one of the general lessons right off is, and I was going to say that one of the suggestions I have is absolutely. I think a lot of times I think that other institutions and other organizations that contact us, we get the general impression that these organizations feel that Indigenous people should just be really glad to be asked to the table, and that should be enough. Oh, we're inviting you to be involved, and oh wait, you want paid? Yes, we do, and I do, because again, my director is very frugal. This is something that we have to keep. I have to argue for quite often, because we're on a tight budget, but we do pay, and it needs to be professional fees. It needs to be a realistic price, a salary, a fee, an honorarium that is in comparison to the enormous knowledge and expertise that these individuals are bringing to the table. And that goes for presenting artists, speakers, reviewers, the whole 9 yards. Yeah. Our board members are not paid, but that's an exception.
Sure.
Can I make just a quick comment real quick?
Yeah, that would be great. And after David, after you make your comment,
Yeah.
we're gonna I'm gonna talk about how we're gonna do questions. So
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Oh, just something occurred to me as you were speaking, ma'am, that there's a lot of high level, huge institutions here in New York City. There have been a few exhibitions lately, and we had been asked to collaborate on some of these exhibitions, in some of the larger museums and so forth. But we have a internal policy that we don't want to participate in a so-called quote unquote advisory committee anymore, because usually you know, that the non-native entity wants to take a lot of our ideas, you know. And if it's not done correctly, we don't have much say-so as to what the final result will be. So one of our more internal policies is that if we usually we're approached by somebody, they want us to participate in some exhibition or some project. If we can't be involved in the policy or the design of the project, we really don't want to participate. It might be worthwhile, but even with our participation, we find that sometimes certain people, certain forces want to limit the native viewpoint, you know, limit our curatorial perspective on it, you know, and that's unfortunate because then again, you wind up with something that's inaccurate, not correct. This has distortions involved. So whatever the project is, we need to have not just any seat at the table, we need to be involved in the design of the project. So thanks.
That's great. Thank you. So we have time for probably like, I think like 2 or 3 questions. I don't want to be too like hopeful about how much time we have for questions, but the way we're going to do questions is that anybody in the webinar is welcome to use the raise hand function. And Leah will allow you to speak, to ask your question and any clarifying questions once our co-facilitators have shared answers with you. And to get us started, we do have some questions in the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and ask those to our co-facilitators to get us started. But remember, if you want to ask your question, you can raise your hand and Leah will allow you to speak, take you off mute. And if you want me to read your question, you can put it in the chat. And also I put this in an earlier communication in the chat, but we'll answer all your questions and share it out after the fact as well. So if we don't get to your question, it doesn't mean it's lost. It just means that we'll type up our answer and share it when we share all the other materials. All right, co-facilitators, Sue Gardner asked very early in our program about an hour ago. She asked, part of our community's history connects to the Battle of Minisink during the Revolutionary War. Joseph Brant is identified in that narrative and the historical record as Mohawk. Should we now be using Haudenosaunee in explaining the shift, or did they at the time self-identify as Mohawk and that should be preserved? And I just want to say, I know Justin spoke to this a little bit, but I wanted to give it room because this question models a lot of what we were talking about, like respectful language, respectful boundaries, and asking. So Justin, if you could take that first, and then David, if you wanted to chime in, we would welcome that as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just feel, especially in, like, say, the last 20 years, certain languages or certain words have become more outdated, but like Mohawk is still just fine. Like we're moving away from Iroquois to Haudenosaunee, and that seems to be like not only just Akwesasne, that seems to be pretty much like Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca. Like everyone is kind of on the same page about that. But like when it comes to Mohawk, like I mentioned, we're Akwesasne, and we're just one of the few pockets that we're still around, and from wherever we're coming from, like you know, from pre-contact or currently too, there's a lot of, you know, Mohawk territories that were, you know, you could claim you were from. Like I mentioned, our sister one that's like an hour away in Gadawage. But I would say too, like, you know, still identifying as Mohawk is fine. We just haven't really found a really great way to transition from that to that. But that's something as a community we're working on, and we have a lot. I'm getting this from all the great language programs that we have right now that are looking at, which was mentioned earlier. When we were putting down our language into translation, a lot of that was coming from from a white educated person that was using their method to do it. So we're actually kind of decolonizing even how we spell things now to make it more reflective of, like, easier to say, easier to communicate with. So we have a lot of great community members currently working on kind of a way to like improve even how we write down our own language currently. So it's in flux. Mohawk is still, I think, very like fine. It's just one of those things I know is being talked about by people who are very more fluent than I am.
naming and, calling people as they are kind of thing.
I just had an interesting idea regarding language after Justin's comment regarding my experience, for example, in my tribes that I'm connected to, Apache tribes that I'm related to at a Mescalero Apache Reservation in New Mexico and in Oklahoma. One group is, the language is no longer being spoken. They were working very hard to have it recorded by linguists from the University of Oklahoma when I was out there in the 70s, but unfortunately the current dialect had ended with the death of the last speaker. But right now, the other descendants have mixed the languages, mixed with the Mescalero Apache on the reservation, Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache language. But even there, where you have a very strong large number of speakers, it's very difficult to keep it alive. You must have a very concerted effort to do that. The larger the population, I think, of speakers, the easier it might be. Here over Shinnecock Nation, the Montauk tribe here on Long Island, New York, during the late 70s, a concerted committee received funding to try to reconstruct the language. And so since the 70s, they've been trying to restore the language. Here, the means that has happened is actually the first Bible translated into native language is called the Stephen Eliot Bible, which was done in 1600s. And that is the main source we have of a written language that's connected to the Shinnecock Montauk tribe, rather than political deeds and documents. Some of like the Wampanoag tribe, for example, in Massachusetts, they have enormous amount of records, deeds, documents, treaties, written in the native language, written phonetically by the European settlers. Over in Long Island, though, we have to depend on the people that have worked on this have depended on this Bible, the Eliot Bible, which is written in a very close dialect to the Shinnecock Montauk language. So it's taken since the 70s, 40, 50 years, and they're still working on it. They have a school on the reservation teaching young children some, basics of the language. But to my knowledge, there's no adult classes being taught in the language on the reservation at this time. Sometimes it boils down to the individual person, that is very much in that easy in this day and age. There's so many distractions, and more so now than ever. I think it's wonderful when some of the tribes get into the new media, digital media, and they can make programs of the language to make it interesting and fun. So they want to communicate with it all the time. That's the only way I think it's going to happen. Because you study languages around the world, like Welsh and all these languages in England, a lot of them have enormous numbers of people. Now, believe it or not, the Navajo nation, hundreds of thousands of people, and they talk about, like, even the young people today are not learning the language, Navajo, the Dene language, as you would think they would. You'd think there'd be 100,000 speakers, and evidently there isn't. So it is an enormous concern, I feel, in a native Indian country, as they call it, preservation of language.
Yeah, if I can make.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, because it's such a concerted effort. Like I said, like the last 30 years, we've had ability to really feel like we've had the opportunity to go further than we had before, because it's hard to explain how much constraints were on both portions of the US and Canada. We have like 3 elementary schools that are divided between Justnina, Gonagotaleo, and basically Cornwall Island. And those are the 3 Canadian schools. And I use the example because a friend gave it to me, because it was such a thing that, like, for the last 20 years, as him doing like classes and cultural teachings, he's seen from like all the school names on all the lockers go from like 10% Ungwe to like 90% English to like today you go in there, now you're seeing beautiful Hmong names across the board, and maybe a few like, you know, honors and whatever it's trendy you name right now. But that is one of those things we're seeing. And we do have a freedom school that is a Mohawk inversion school that goes to pretty much like a 3rd grade, 4th grade, and then they transition either to a state school, which I mean United States, or into one of the Canadian elementaries. And there is where they are learning traditional ways, they're speaking Ganya-Geha, they are doing all of it. And then after that, then between all those elementaries, you're kind of splitting between either like a Salmon River is the high school for Franklin County, Messina is the St. Lawrence County one, and then General Vanier in Cornwall is the Canadian one that they can go to. And out of the 3, Messina is pushing harder on more, giving more access to Indigenous classes, and also offering, Ganya-Geha as a class. Same with Salmon River, and it's at least dips into like middle school into high school. So I will say those 2 things have really helped, and our community is like we're not like all immersive, but like I said, I feel like every generation that's passing is getting more of it than the previous ones. And our language programs, as I mentioned, are like we're doing Facebook Lives. We've had a YouTube channel for a while. We have an app for Ganya-Geha. So we're trying our best to keep it alive. And we even have people, like I said, trying to make it easier, like rewriting it that makes more sense to us than. And to David's point, like, we have Jesuit hymns, because I say Akwesasne a lot, but we are considered in the federal government the St. Regis Mohawk Indians. And that St. Regis is that lineage of Jesuits pretty much trying to convert us. I mean, I grew up on St. Regis Road, and on the point of St. Regis is the first Catholic church, the first one in the territory. We have like 2 other. Well, one's defunct now. Now the people who run our restaurants own it, and I don't know what they're going to do with it. But yeah, there's a lot of churches on a reservation. So I mean, they tried really hard at converting us.
Thank you so much. So like I could go on for hours with you 3. Just what I want to tell everybody before we talk about next steps and action items and checking out, and I'm going to give the last word to our co-facilitators. I just want to remind everybody that this whole year in 2023, we're talking about centering Indigenous perspectives and experiences and understanding slavery in New York State. So we'll be talking about this stuff all year. And so I hope you'll join us for more programs, because I'm hoping for more amazing stuff like this. So next steps and action items. So there's a session survey. Leah's going to put the link in the chat, and you can start working on that now as we kind of go through the last few minutes. And we would love it if you take it before we're done today, so that we can get your feedback right away about this program. Your continued learning activity is something that we do at the end of all of our programs, our webinars, our DHPSNY dialogues, because we started out with you in 2022 saying anti-racism is about actions, it's verbs, it's what we do. And so your continued learning activity for you to follow up on is identify an opportunity to create, build, or fortify relationship between you and your organization and the Native American community in your organization's location. So literally, please go out and do the things that Justin, David, and Colette talked with us about today. Go ask, go extend yourself, extend hospitality, share your curiosity in respectful ways, and build those relationships. And then just inviting everybody to our next dialogue is May 11th at 3 p.m. And we'll be talking with folks from Cooperstown graduate program, the Cooperstown Library, and the way that the Cooperstown graduate program, the library, and the local Mexican community has partnered to create a Day of the Dead program for the town of Cooperstown, which is historically a very white village. So really excited to talk with the folks who are going to do that with us in May. And remember, take that survey, do it now. And I'm going to ask our presenters, our co-presenters, to give us the last word. What's your last thought? And so I'll ask Colette to go first. I'll ask Justin to go second, and David to be our final thought. Colette, to you.
It's a perfect setup for what I wanted to leave you with. I would just recommend that you, as an organization, that you engage with individuals other than, I mean, it's fine to engage with elders and clan mothers and native speakers, but I would encourage you to engage with all sorts of individuals in the Indigenous community. And keep in mind that those individuals you're working with, regardless of their status and their position in the community, are basically speaking for themselves. They're not speaking for their nation. They are speaking from their own perspective, from their gender perspective, from their age perspective, and their personal experience. And all of those perspectives are valid, but they're going to all be very different. And the other thought is very important, is to make space for new voices, and to remember and give platform to the up and coming generation. One of the things that I noticed in all the years that I've been doing this is that when we used to have dance groups or groups of Haudenosaunee people come to the museum to present, it was usually the elders who were in the forefront, the older ladies and gentlemen. The last 10 years, when groups of Haudenosaunee people come here, those who are speaking with great passion and great knowledge are the young people. And it's great to see. It really is. And it's nice to have seen that come full circle.
Thanks, Colette.
Sure.
Justin, go ahead. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you so much to Colette and David. They're doing such inspiring, amazing work, and listening to both of them has like really put a perspective of like, gets me excited to keep doing more and trying to represent our community as best as we can. I really thank everyone for attending, and so much of what we've said is especially about just coming to see us. And I don't know if this is okay, but Akwesasne Travel is our kind of experience-based travel program. If you go to their website, you can book experiences, and I think that's also a good way, because these are cultivated to represent our community and our culture, and meet artists, meet people, and then there even is a museum tour that we could give you. So I mean, that's one way to really just put your toe in the water, is that these are designed to really just represent who we are, at least in Akwesasne.
Thanks for that. I think that goes directly to like what Colette was saying, like immerse yourself in relationship and experience. David, last word is yours, my friend. And I will say thank you to everybody for being here. And I'm going to toss it to David for our last thought of today.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Kate Phillipson for inviting me today, and Ari as well. It's been a great honor. I'd like to thank my colleagues on the committee speaking today, Justin and Colette. It's been very, very interesting. Thank you very much. And just to end, I would advocate that don't give up in terms of approaching Native communities. Amarinda, our organization, has always supported trying to support the Native-led organizations, whether individual people, artists, or any organization, rather than the large non-Native institution who say they want to help Native Americans. Go to the Native-led and managed organizations, because they need support too, and ask them what they could use, what is helpful to them, And last word I would say in terms of preservation of archives, administrative files and archives, if you work with a Native community, keep that in mind. These things in today's world are very central and very important to Native communities. Tribal governments, you know, we're individual governments, really like countries within countries. You know, we have that status, and the mismanagement, not through Native people's fault in many cases, have been used to control Native people. They've been stolen. They've been used to manipulate and disenfranchise nations. So for Native people to learn and to be trained, if that's what's required, to handle, administer their own files, their own papers, their own, you know, information. Information in many cases is power in this day and age, and it has been misused greatly to the disadvantage of Native tribes and nations and organizations. So archivists out there who want to help, that might be a very, very helpful thing in many cases to help tribes manage their own papers, files, and administrative files, not just cultural objects, but papers in this day and age. Because these things are used legally to hurt many tribes and put them at a disadvantage in today's world. So that's also very important too to consider. So good luck out there. Thank you again for the day. Appreciate it.